Hello, thank you everyone for having us. I'm just going to be sharing my screen. Can everyone hear me? And do you guys see the whole PowerPoint?
Yeah,
Yeah, okay. All right, Vasanthi, hit it.
thank you. Thank you so much, Dean Badi. It's an honor to present here. Thank you so much to Muwatin for inviting and accommodating us, and also Dean Badi for facilitating. We recognize the immense privilege we have in presenting from a complicit settler-colonial country on stolen land, and we live in great sorrow as the genocide and occupation of Palestine relentlessly continues even as we speak. The past year has witnessed a mass student movement for the liberation of Palestine in universities all over the world through BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Following a protracted 62-day encampment, the University of Windsor distinguished itself as one of only 3 Canadian universities to reach a landmark BDS-based agreement with pro-Palestinian students, notably for being the most comprehensive in North America. At the heart of this agreement lies a commitment to hold the university accountable for its financial investments, operational practices, and policy framework through the lens of international law, human rights law, and domestic law. Now, the basic strategy of the BDS campaign globally is to make Israel's oppression and dispossession of the Palestinians more costly for Israel, to expose the apartheid and gross violations that form the foundation of Brand Israel, and to create a broad movement for solidarity with Palestine. But as will be familiar to many, the movement is anchored in international law. The Unified Palestinian Call for BDS by the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, PACB, demands that the tactics of BDS be used to shame and force Israel to meet its obligations to recognize the Palestinian people's inalienable right to self-determination, and to fully comply with international law by ending its occupation and colonization of all Arab lands and dismantling the wall, recognizing the fundamental rights of Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return, as stipulated in UN Resolution 194. The inherent contradictions that arise from using the master's tool, the liberal legal system that underpins the occupation of Palestine and oppresses their resistance, but also the capitalist tactics like consumer boycotts and socially responsible investing, which are also integral to Zionist strategies, have been discussed before. However, these contradictions have never felt more pronounced than they are today, in light of the relentless Israeli violence that is perpetrating an ongoing genocide and regional war. This is compounded by the dehumanization of Palestinians and Arabs, alongside the active involvement of US, Canada, and Europe in military operations, as well as the suppression of pro-Palestinian resistance within their borders. As Faisal Kuti said in a recent article, Gaza has become the graveyard of liberalism, including its human rights system. He quotes an anonymous commentator who stated, "People think Gaza is occupied, but in reality, Gaza is free, but the whole world is occupied." So what does this mean for the BDS movement? There is a wealth of scholarship employing a Gramscian perspective to highlight the movement's potential to challenge and disrupt Zionism and Israel's dominance in ideological and discursive arenas. For instance, in the anti-racism discourse, allegations of anti-Semitism are often used to silence discussions about Islamophobia and other forms of racial prejudice. Similarly, in narratives surrounding the rule of law and democracy, Israel is portrayed as a liberal stronghold amid illiberal threats. BDS disrupts these spaces by showing how Israel fails the standards of even a reasonable liberal state through its grave human rights violations. However, using the tools of liberal law to counter-hegemonize liberal spaces has its limits. It can't even stop a genocide. So in our presentation today, we draw on the framework of Fanonian resistance presented by the martyred Palestinian writer and teacher Basil al-Araj through his essay, Live Like a Porcupine, Fight Like a Flea, to describe and contextualize the movement in University of Windsor as a counter-hegemony through decolonial anti-imperialist radical tactics, which also challenges the master's tools of international law.
Hello. So as Al-Araj describes it, the Palestinian resistance lives like porcupines. They are night animals with a high sense of security that live underground in large holes connected to a network of tunnels. Its pain is deep, but its grudge is even deeper. And when threatened, it wails and attacks with spikes. The flea, however, fights by exhausting and demoralizing its host, by annoying, sucking its blood, and not allowing it to rest. And living like a porcupine. So throughout the journey, our encampment was designated as the liberation zone. This was a deliberate use of liberatory anti-colonial discourse, a strategic initiative to create a decolonial space by disrupting the entrenched hegemonic environment of the university, where we are cast as the threats. Within this space, we had only a few tents, far fewer than in U of T and Columbia University encampments. As such, only a humble number of us were present, while others rested like porcupines at night. We organized workshops, education circles, and discussions to learn how to adapt tactics from these resistance movements. Our approach was informed by deep community engagement, fostering connections and educating others about Palestine through a radical resistance lens. This disruption of hegemonic space required a concerted effort to challenge and dismantle the pervasive structures of Western hyper-individualism, capitalism, and white supremacy, which we identified as foundational to Israeli exceptionalism and occupation. Despite our smaller numbers, though our broader community in Windsor was large, the university recognized us as sufficiently prickly enough and restless enough to engage with. So after 62 days of this on-the-ground disruption, the signing of our agreement took place in the President's Building, an emblematic site of colonial power, both administratively and also due to its proximity to the colonial American border state. The building faces the American border. The location's significance illuminated the importance of entering the space with the memory and spirit of the Shuhada, the martyrs, embedded in our hearts, minds, and spirits. Here is a photograph of us the day we were signing the agreement. So as you can see, I wore a traditional thobe purchased in Ramallah, featuring the colors of the Palestinian flag. This hand-embroidered garment, reminiscent of the infamous Intifada dress, serves as a powerful symbol of resistance within this moment. Secondly, the kufi is demonstrated in this photo, which is another significant emblem of Palestinian identity. This was also noteworthy given the rise of anti-Palestinian racism that has been barring individuals from wearing kufiyas and entering buildings as a result.
Nadeen, we need to slow down. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Over here, I wore the kofia as a headscarf, drawing inspiration from previous legendary figures in the resistance movement. Number 3, before signing the agreement, we collectively engaged in prayer, reading Surah Al-Fatiha, Surah Al-Tin, and Surah Al-Nasr. We grounded ourselves and our commitment in spirituality before formalizing this agreement. What's interesting here is we did not request for some time to engage in prayer. In fact, we demanded it by naturally performing it. This was critical given the Islamophobic tropes, a fundamentalist terror associated with Muslim praying. And lastly, the prominent display of the Palestinian flag in the bottom right corner was a defiant gesture. It reflected our indomitable spirit and refusal to allow it to be hidden. This flag, sourced from Palestine, symbolized our unwavering commitment to the Palestinian cause. So, our demands and actions were prefigurative of a politics on decolonization and liberation. We were steadfast in our refusal to allow any erasure of explicit mentions of genocide, occupation, and Palestine itself. The agreement begins with an explicit acknowledgement of anti-Palestinian racism, without the usual liberal juxtaposition of anti-Semitism in the same line. The section on support for scholars, including re-establishing institutional relationships with Palestinian universities, such as Birzeit, while explicitly mentioning the scholasticide in Gaza. Just for the translator to have some time, I put the agreement clause, item number 4F, subclause 3 at the bottom to give a second to read it. All right. And then the next item we have is item number 4G3. So although the concluding declaration starts off with a general condemnation of all violations of fundamental human rights where they may occur, there is explicit mention of decolonization, human rights, social justice, and anti-racism in the context of the occupation of Palestine and destruction of Gaza by Israel. Like fleas, we exhausted the administration into naming Israel as the aggressor.
So a pivotal aspect of this agreement is the implementation of an academic boycott against Israeli universities, which the language says will remain in effect until the right of Palestinian self-determination has been realized as determined by the United Nations. Unsurprisingly, this clause has received the most backlash, primarily centered on common arguments of academic freedom and university neutrality. While we can discuss these points during the Q&A, a more compelling argument relates to complicity, which has been famously articulated by Noam Chomsky, which is also called the glass house argument, asserting that American, but also European and Canadian academia are deeply intertwined with the military-industrial complex and other entities directly responsible for Israel's impunity and oppressive actions. How does an academic boycott of Israel by Western universities challenge US and Western hegemony that is a root cause of the occupation, he has asked. I think the Arabic, it's quite sweet. The Arabic interpretation is
okay. We're good to go again. Thank you so much. And my apologies for the interruption.
Oh, no, that's all right. Thank you. For this, our answer is that challenging Zionism and US imperialism are not mutually exclusive. The focus of the agreement was and is Israel's aggression and opposing Zionism. As Sarah McMahon has said, what matters is not the presence of contradictions, which are inevitable given our positionality in the enabler's territory. But did we challenge deeply entrenched and heavily policed boundaries of the discourse of Palestinian-Israeli politics? In fact, by refusing to engage in liberal or left whataboutery by mentioning other countries, the agreement has pushed the most heavily policed boundary in academia with the boycott clause. Ironically, even the use of international law in the boycott clause, self-determination, but as determined by the United Nations, works in this case as it centers the dysfunctionality of the UN in recognizing Palestine self-determination. The limitations of BDS stemming from its juridical international law nature is most apparent in the divestment component. The university committed to ethical investment practices and is revising its responsible investment policies, but which is based on the UN's environmental, social, and governance, or ESG principles, to explicitly incorporate international and domestic law. But It refused to endorse an arms embargo. There is already extensive scholarship critiquing the self-regulation-based UN mechanism, labeling it as cuddly capitalism or greenwashing that merely diverts capital flows rather than achieving true divestment. It prioritizes capitalist interests over social values, ultimately perpetuating the logics of financialization and commodification of justice and rights. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the weapons industry investments. In light of international law around just war and the right to self-defense invoked by Ukraine and Israel, weapons and associated multi-use technologies, such as AI surveillance systems and drones, are now framed as enhancing democracy, territorial integrity, and human rights. Tech companies such as Google and Microsoft have integrated themselves so deeply into our lives that divesting from them has become virtually impossible, regardless of what they do. Additionally, regarding Palestine, the prevailing compromise is to restrict divestment to companies listed in the UN Human Rights Council database that are involved in settlements in the UN-defined occupied territories, primarily the West Bank, effectively shielding other Israeli companies from scrutiny. So participants in the movement at UWindsor had to grapple with these contradictions. Much of it is created by international law, while also challenging the administrative power structures. Although the movement succeeded in not confining scrutiny of companies only to those listed in the UN HRC database, it was still a compromise. The compromise, nevertheless, highlights how racial capitalism and colonial imperialism are mutually reinforcing through liberal international law. Like fleas targeting the most vulnerable parts of its host, the movement was able to expose the substantial threat that financial and economic dimensions of liberation pose to the very structures of the global order established by the West. But it also shows the importance of having new tactics to bring down what John Ikenberry has called the liberal Leviathan, the American international political order.
So now we will look at what it means for resistance and liberation of Palestine. Bassel al-Araj emphasized the importance of integrating armed struggle with the boycott movement, blending legal, economic, and grassroots strategies. However, he cautioned against an over-reliance on international law. He viewed it as a tool historically designed for the colonizer and often deployed for the normalization of hegemony. In his essay, Out of the Law and Into the Revolution, Al-Araj stressed the need to transcend legal structures. The BDS movement adopted its tactics in the 2000s to challenge Israel's narrative of exceptionalism, which is based on its claim to be a homeland for Jewish exiles and its self-presentation as the only modern democracy in the region. The campaign's universalist conception of rights recast Israel as a state like any other, with the same obligations and responsibilities that it has ceaselessly violated, which was crucial. However, despite the ongoing genocide broadcasted to the entire world, numerous ICJ rulings against Israel, and unanimous condemnation from United Nations Special Rapporteurs, none of the efforts to name and shame through international legal institutions have succeeded in stopping or even moderating Israel's behaviors. As Rob Knox has stated, for many, Israel's actions may represent a perversion of international law. For example, the right of self-defense, which is supposed to be limited by necessity and proportionality. But he also pointed that this is international law not a perversion. The position of a reasonable bourgeois state in international law, which is the standard that the BDS movement is holding Israel to, is an imperial one. And lastly, in Al-A'raj's work, The Economy in the Intifada, Al-A'raj presents a model of resistance that reinforces the importance of adaptability and diversity in resistance strategies amidst the time of the monsters. Through his work, we see that in their fear of dismantling existing structures, including international law, communities often end up de-radicalizing themselves as a form of self-sabotage in response to their inability to adapt tactics and strategies to changing circumstances. This rigidity and approach can lead individuals to feel disillusioned and hopeless, ultimately turning them into a liberalized adversary of the movement. This represents a significant threat to the national struggle against the prevailing global order and the pursuit of transformative abolition and change. As Knox noted, Gaza urges us to examine the systems of exploitation and domination that shape our contemporary world, as these dynamics are the key to understanding the violence and the occupation, rather than international law. Consequently, we must adjust our tactics to dismantle these relations of domination. Through his metaphor of the porcupine and the flea, Al-A'raj's counter-hegemonic resistance asks for a symbiotic, multifaceted, adaptive approach with community empowerment, liberatory praxis, and the continuous evolution of defense mechanisms. As such, we must understand and accept what the revolution requires from us from different points of time, even if it means throwing an expo marker or a stick on a drone. This nuanced understanding is crucial for sustaining the integrity and the effectiveness of the resistance movement, ensuring it remains a powerful force against colonial imperialism and in pursuit of Palestinian liberation and the downfall of the current cancerous hegemonic structure. Thank you.